So in this video, we're going to discuss the quantity theory of money. And the quantity theory of money um, essentially helps us understand what the effects of increasing the money supply are going to be on inflation. So we've talked about inflation pretty extensively now, but we know that with expansionary policy, it leads to increases in the price level. The quantity theory of money gives us a little bit better of an idea of exactly how that occurs. And so to understand that, the quantity theory of money, we need to understand a couple pieces. And the first piece is that, any growth in nominal GDP is going to either come from growth in output or growth in the price level. So if there's increases in nominal GDP, it's either through prices growing or real GDP growing. Okay, there's no other source, and so why? And we can understand that by understanding that nominal GDP. Well, there's two variables when we calculate nominal GDP: the price of goods, the market value of the goods that we're producing, and the number of goods that are being produced. GDP measuring the number of goods being produced, nominal GDP measuring it at the current year's prices. So if there's growth in nominal GDP, it's from one of those two sources: prices or quantities. Quantity being growth in real GDP, prices being growth in the price level or inflation. The second assumption we're going to make is the stronger of the two assumptions. This first assumption is pretty much given. The second assumption, not so much. We'll look at it empirically, whether this theory holds up, but the general idea is that the rate at which the money supply grows is going to be exactly equal to the rate of the growth in nominal GDP. So let's unpackage these two assumptions one by one. For the first assumption, let's just use a little example. Very simple. Assume we have an economy, a society where we only produce one good. That good is basketballs. Initially in 2019, the nominal GDP was equal to $800, where the number of basketballs being produced was 20. The price of each basketball was $40. Therefore, nominal GDP was equal to $800, and being that the base year is 2019, real GDP is also equal to $800. And then let's just say, we don't know where the source is coming from, but let's just say in 2020, nominal GDP increases to $1,000. And so the question is, well, is that if that increase is coming from quantity, or if that increase is coming from in nominal GDP is coming from an increase in price. And so in the first scenario, in scenario A, I assume that the number of basketballs being produced is exactly the same. There's no growth in output, and the entire growth in nominal GDP is from growth in the price of basketballs. So in 2020, nominal GDP, again, we know nominal GDP increases to $1,000, but being that output didn't increase at all in this first scenario, real GDP in 2020 under this first scenario is still going to be only equal to $800. Why? Because the only thing that increased was the price. There's no fundamental increase in output. Therefore, real GDP doesn't change. In the second scenario, the price of basketball stays the same. It's still $40. But the number of basketballs being produced is equal to 25. Again, nominal GDP is equal to $1,000, but real GDP in this case, real GDP in 2020 is now equal to $1,000. So if we look at the growth rates of real GDP or output in scenarios A and B, well, we can see that real GDP growth GDP, let's do scenario A first. Real GDP growth is going to be equal to real GDP in 2020 minus real GDP in 2019 over real GDP in 2019 times 100 to get into a percentage, which when we plug this in, it's 800 for 2019. Real GDP in 2020 is 800. Therefore, 800 minus 800 is 0, meaning 0 over 800 is still going to be 0, which means there's going to be no growth in output in the first scenario. There is growth in the price level. So taking a look at the price level, still in scenario A, now looking at the inflation rate. Well, inflation is just going to be the price level in 2020 minus the price level in 2019 over the price level in 2019, where now, what was our price level in 2019? 40. What's our price level in 2020 in scenario A? $50. So 50 minus 40 divided by 40 is equal to 1/4. Multiply that by 100, we get 25%. Okay. So just a little bit of practice in finding growth rates, but we see that, and calculating inflation, we see that inflation, the sole source of growth in nominal GDP. Notice nominal GDP increases by 25%. There's no increase in output, meaning growth in real GDP is 0, where growth in the price level is 25% in this first scenario. In the second scenario, scenario B, well, we see that real GDP growth again, scenario B, is now going to be equal to the same formula from before, real GDP in 2020 minus real GDP in 2019 over real GDP in 2019, which when looking at real GDP in 2019 and real GDP in 2020 in scenario B, real GDP in 2020 is 1,000. Real GDP in 2019 is 800. That ends up being 200 over 800, which is equal to 1/4. Multiply that by 100 equals 25%. Okay. Inflation, as you can see, the price did not inflate in scenario B, so inflation is going to be equal to 0%. Okay. So in the first scenario, in scenario A, again, the sole source of the increase in nominal GDP comes from the growth in prices, whereas in scenario B, the opposite is true. The growth in nominal GDP is solely from the growth in output in real GDP. Okay? So to summarize, well, when our growth in nominal GDP is 25%, and again, in both scenarios, well, it's not surprising that when we aggregate the growth in output or real GDP with the growth in the price level or inflation, well, that in both scenarios, when we aggregate them, they both equal to the rate of growth for nominal GDP. Okay, and this is the point of the example, is to prove that if there's growth in nominal GDP, it's either going to come from growth in output or growth in the price level. Okay. So that's the first assumption for the quantity theory of money, and it holds up. It's not that strong of an assumption. It holds up. It's tough to argue against. The second assumption, however, is not as clear. Okay. So again, that first assumption says the growth rate of nominal GDP is going to be equal to the growth rate of real GDP plus the inflation rate. Okay? That's what we just covered. The second assumption establishes that this growth rate of nominal GDP, well, it's going to be exactly equal to the growth rate of the money supply. And so replacing the growth rate of nominal GDP with the growth rate of the money supply, we find that when we rearrange, that inflation is going to be equal to the difference between the money supply, or the growth rate of the money supply, and the growth rate of real GDP. And that's the big takeaway from the quantity theory of money, is that inflation, yes, if there is a large growth in the money supply, is it going to lead to inflation? Most likely, yes, so long as that growth in the money supply is greater than the growth rate of real GDP, which means if there are large increases in output, then large increases in the money supply are not going to lead to large levels of inflation. Why? Because the growth rate of real GDP and the growth rate of the money supply are both growing at high rates. Therefore, the difference between the two of them is relatively small, meaning inflation is relatively low. On the other hand, if the money supply is growing, if we're in an expansionary monetary policy time frame, and the money supply is growing at a relatively high rate, but there's not a lot of growth in output, not a lot of growth in real GDP, well, then that can spur on future inflation. So this is the general theory of how the money supply is going to affect the inflation rate. That's nice in theory, but does it hold up over time? Well, when we look at I think 110 countries over a 30-year period from 1960 to 1990. Now, the data's a little bit older, it's about 30 years old, but the general idea still holds, and the fact that this is across the globe gives strong support that the quantity theory of money is a valid theory to consider when implementing monetary policy. So we see that for the most part, the quantity theory of money holds because if we have the inflation rate on the y-axis and the growth rate of the money supply minus the growth rate of real GDP on the x-axis, well then at this 45-degree line, this is a one-for-one equality, meaning right on this line means that the inflation rate is exactly equal to the difference between the growth rate of the money supply and the growth rate of real GDP. And we see that for the most part, whether inflation rates are relatively low or relatively high, as we see in Argentina, the quantity theory of money, for the most part, holds. Why? Because the inflation rate is roughly equal to the difference between the growth rate of the money supply and the growth rate of real GDP. Okay, so we look at this as pretty strong evidence that the quantity theory of money, that it holds over time. All right, so now we kind of understand how increasing the money supply affects inflation. But the effects of monetary policy and increasing the money supply, they're going to carry out in the credit market. So in the next video, we're going to discuss the credit market and then start discussing the actual operations of a bank and take a look at a bank's balance sheet. Okay, so that's in the coming videos.